And welcome back. Today we will be reading Section 3, Chapter 14 of Bob Thomas's Walt Disney, an American Original. On the afternoon of December 7th, 1941, Walt Disney answered the telephone at his Los Feliz home. The studio manager told him, "Walt, the studio police just phoned me. The Army's moving in on us." Still shocked by the news that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, Walt asked what he meant. "The Army! 500 soldiers," said the manager. "They told me they're moving in." "What did you tell them?" Walt asked. "I said I'd have to call you." What did they say to that?" "They said, go ahead and call them. We're moving in anyways." The soldiers commandeered the Disney soundstage, ordered the film equipment removed, and installed gear for repaired trucks and anti-aircraft guns. An officer remarked that the stage was ideal because it could be used during a blackout. Next, the Army claimed the employee parking sheds and used them for storing 3 million rounds of ammunition. Military police were posted at each gate, and all Disney workers, including Walt and Roy, were fingerprinted and given identification badges to wear at all times. Artists doubled up in rooms on the animation building so the soldiers would have places to sleep. The Army unit, which supported anti-aircraft installations in the mountains around Los Angeles, remained at the studio for 8 months. It moved out when fears of a Japanese attack on the mainland were over, but other military personnel moved in. The Disney studio had converted to war. The studio had already been preparing for its wartime role before Pearl Harbor. Walt wanted to prove that he could make training films, and in March 1941, he enlisted the help of a project method engineer from nearby Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, George W. Papin. Working in his free time, Papin assisted in preparing a film, 4 Methods of Flush Riveting. It was so effective that Lockheed used it to instruct the flood of new aircraft workers. Canadian officials studied it and were convinced that Disney could help their war effort. The studio was commissioned to supply 4 shorts to promote sales of war savings certificates and stamps, and another to instruct recruits on use of the boys' anti-tank gun. Shortly after the United States entered the war, Walt received a telephone call from the Navy Bureau of Aeronautics in Washington. The officer said the Navy wanted 20 short films on aircraft identification, the first ones to be delivered in 90 days, the remainder within 6 months. "The budget's $80,000, he said. "Can you do it?" Walt said he thought he could. "Okay, Mr. Disney, if you consider this a contract, we have a recording of this conversation. Go right ahead. We will send a man out in 3 weeks. When Walt hung up the telephone, he realized that he had no recording of the conversation to give him evidence of the contract. But he went ahead with the project, gathered all the information he could find on aircraft identification. Arrived from Washington, he was surprised to see the studio had prepared exactly what was needed. The 20 films were completed at a cost of $72,000 minus $8,000 under the allotment, but not enough to take care of contingencies and to provide a profit. More orders for films came to the Disney studio, from the Navy for aircraft carrier landing signals, from the Agricultural Department for Food Will Win the War, from the Army for a film to indoctrinate airplane spotters in the WEFT systems, wings, engines, fuselage, tail. The studio produced Chicken Little, an anti-Nazi film showing the evils of mass hysteria, Education for Death, depicting how German youth were converted into Nazis, and Defense Against Invasion, promoting immunization against disease. The orders came in such volume that Walt and Roy were forced to reconsider the direction of the company. With the market for cartoon features at its lowest point and the studio staff facing depletion by the draft, it seemed prudent to cut back on features, except for Bambi, which was still making tedious progress. Walt abandoned preparations for Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan and shut down animation on The Wind in the Willows. A favorite studio legend concerns the animator who was assigned to The Wind in the Willows departed to serve in the Army, then returned 4 years later to resume animating the same sequence in the same film. Walt was stimulated by the challenge of interpreting complex subjects in a compelling and enlightening way. He applied his skill to explain the bomb sites and factory methods with the same zeal that he had to recounting the exploits of Mickey Mouse and Snow White. His technique was demonstrated in Story Conference Notes of May 24, 1942. For a subject to be called The Winged Scourge, the film was being made for the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, Nelson Rockefeller, and the storyboard showed a lecture on malaria prevention being interrupted by the seven dwarves. The film is basically to tell people how to get rid of mosquitoes. The only reason to bring the dwarves in is to add a little interest. When you get into gags and impossible things, you're not accomplishing the job we're supposed to do. Show in a simple way of how to get rid of mosquitoes. The idea, as I saw it, was we'd talk the picture, and after you've explained everything and emphasized the importance of getting rid of the mosquito, it's a serious thing, then to get relief a bit, we'd go into the operation of the thing. Prep up the ending by taking 7 ordinary citizens, the narrator says. It's not a difficult task. We're selecting 7 people at random. Then we show them it's the dwarves. We take each dwarf and he goes about his work, does it as he's supposed to be done. Maybe it's Dopey, spreading the oil. Let him be cute, but don't go into these gags. Where you'd get your interest, we'd throw it to the music. Digging the ditch with a scythe. He's butting the weeds. Dopey's getting the crankcase oil. He goes up and gets his old oil and comes on off and sprays it over the thing. Just doing the business. But he's doing it in rhythm. Nothing to laugh at to beat hell, but something to listen to. It's a serious problem, but we are showing how simple it is. Even Dopey can do it. The demand for war films continued, and the Disney studio, which had previously been averaging 30,000 feet of completed film a year, now was producing 300,000 feet a year. The greatly increased volume was accomplished by a smaller staff working longer hours. Walt wrote to a friend, For some time now, the studio has been working on a 6-day basis with 2 nights of overtime each week. However, I have learned that if this is continued over a certain period of time, the efficiency of the personnel is impaired. So we have to set a limit of 54 hours per week. A mental fatigue results in this particular type of work, and although we are doing our best to combat it, we must get our government films out as needed. The draft had taken 1/3 of Walt's artists, and he worried whether he could continue his output with a depleted staff. Navy and Army officers attached to the studio offered to make representations to draft boards. Walt suggested, Let's bring the draft board members over here. They think we're just making Mickey Mouse. We'll show them what else we're doing. When draft board members discovered they had to be cleared by Army and Navy intelligence as well as the FBI, and then could not enter certain areas because of top security work, their attitudes changed. So vital was the Disney war work that drafted employees were sent back to the studio in uniform to resume their work. Some of the Disney workers chose to stay at the studio, others did not. One of those who left was Card Walker, who had come up through the ranks and in early 1942 was a unit manager in cost control on the short subjects. Walker visited Walt's office and told of his intention to join the Navy. At first, Walt argued that the young man possessed valuable knowledge that was essential to the studio's war work. Well, Walt, said Walker, I feel very emotional about it. I just want to get into the war. Walt paused and admitted that he envied Walker. Walt reminisced about his own experience with the ambulance corps in France, and he concluded, You're a lucky guy. I'd like to go myself. It wasn't easy for Walt to adjust to sharing his studio with outsiders. Not only did the armed forces and federal officials have the run of the place, Lockheed Aircraft also occupied space for manufacturing. The wartime invasion extended even to Walt's private office. An admiral requested a rush project, a film about rules of the nautical road. The admiral didn't have authorization as yet, but the film was urgently needed to instruct new navigators. The author of a book on navigation, a Navy commander, arrived at the Disney studio. Since the commander had no place to stay, Walt volunteered his own small bedroom off his studio office. The commander stayed for months, washing and hanging up his laundry in Walt's bathroom. The film was completed before the Navy came through with an appropriation. Walt made frequent trips to Washington for dealings with the government. When he couldn't get a hotel reservation, he sat through several performances in a movie house in order to get some rest. During one of the Washington trips, he met with Frank Capra, the director who had convinced Harry Cohn that Columbia Pictures should release Mickey Mouse. Capra had joined the Army Signal Corps, and he complained to Walt. I've got to get out of Washington. I can't make pictures here. Have you got any room at the studio? Walt agreed to give him space, and Capra moved in, assembled a staff, and borrowed artists and facilities from the studio to prepare the series called Why We Fight. The Capra unit was not funded until later. Business relations between the Disney studio and the government were chaotic. At the beginning of the war, the Disney board of directors voted to donate the studio's services at cost as its contribution to the war effort. Government bookkeepers could neither understand nor permit this, and they insisted on paying costs plus a small profit, thus permitting the government to question all expenditures. The accountants couldn't fathom the workings of the movie business. They demanded to know why a crew should be paid for standing by between projects. Walt tried to explain that he had to maintain his staff so he could undertake a new project when it appeared. Wrangles over financing continued more than 2 years after the war. Some of the Disney war work was never paid for. Walt's artists designed more than 1,400 insignia for military units at an average cost of $25. I had to do it, Walt said afterwards. Those kids grew up on Mickey Mouse. I owed it to them. In December 1942, John L. Sullivan, a Treasury Department official, telephoned Walt. Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, had an urgent special project he wanted to discuss. Can you fly to Washington tonight? Sullivan asked. Walt mentioned his daughter Diana's birthday. He had twice been away on her birthday. He didn't want to miss another one. This is very important, Sullivan insisted, and Walt agreed to make the flight. Walt presumed the project would be a campaign to sell war bonds, but when he arrived in Morgenthau's office, he learned of a different mission. We want you to help us sell people on paying income tax, Morgenthau announced. The suggestion puzzled Walt. Wait a minute, he said. You're the Treasury speaking. You're the United States government. Sell people on paying taxes. If you don't pay them, you put them in jail. Guy T. Helvering, the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, spoke up. That's my trouble. Under the new tax bill, we've got 15 million new taxpayers next year. I can't prosecute 15 million people. We've got to make them understand what taxes are and the part of the taxes play in winning the war. I came back here all prepared to help you sell bonds, Walt remarked. That's the point, Helvering said. People think when they buy a bond that's going to pay for the war. But how are we going to pay off the bonds? By taxes. We don't want to prosecute these people. We don't want them to pay their taxes and be excited about paying their taxes as a patriotic thing. Morgenthau said to Walt, Now you've got the idea. See what you could do for us. That evening, Walt met over drinks with Sullivan and Helvering at Sullivan's house in Virginia. The two Treasury men outlined the points they sought to put across to the public, and Walt began devising an idea for the film. He called the studio and ordered his story crew to start work. Then he telephoned his daughter Diane to wish her a happy birthday. Walt hurried back to California. It was late December, and Morgenthau wanted the film in the nation's theaters by February. The cartoon had to be completed and processed through Technicolor in less than 6 weeks. Walt dropped everything else to work on the film. He and his crew labored 18 hours a day, sleeping on cots in the animation building. When the storyboards were completed, Walt flew to Washington to show them to Morgenthau. Neither Sullivan nor Helvering was permitted in Morgenthau's office during the presentation. Only Morgenthau's secretary and an aide were present. Walt was warned beforehand. Keep an eye on the secretary. She was a lot of influence. Walt set up the storyboards and went into one of his eloquent performances. He described how Donald Duck was patriotic in the extreme. Except when it came to paying taxes. But when Donald was shown that paying taxes meant helping to win the war, his attitude changed. He refused calculators and headache pills, filled out the simplified tax form, and hurried to the mailbox to file his return early. Red, white, and blue flags in his eyes lighted up, and he raced from California to Washington to submit his tax in person. Walt's audience of 3 sat expressionless through the entire recital, and they remained silent when Walt finished. Then the aide said tentatively, Well, I always visualized that you would create a little character who'd be called Mr. Taxpayer. The secretary was more blunt. I don't like Donald Duck. Morgenthau said nothing, and Walt's Irish temper began to mount. Well, you want to get this message over, he said. I've given you Donald Duck. At our studio, that's the equivalent of giving you Clark Gable out of the MGM student stable. Donald Duck is known by the American public. He'll open doors to the theaters. They won't be running a cartoon of Mr. Taxpayer. They'll be running a Donald Duck cartoon. By giving you this, I'll be losing money. Every theater that plays this short will knock off a Donald Duck cartoon that would have been booked. I did it because I want this thing to be successful. I thought it was the only way to tell a story, by using a character they know and putting him into a situation that they themselves will be in. If you don't like this, I'll have to throw away half the picture because it's already in work." The Secretary of the Treasury looked up from his desk and said resigningly, "I'll leave it to you." Walt hurried back to California to finish the film, titled The New Spirit, and the Treasury ordered an unprecedented 1,100 prints to saturate the nation before the March 15th deadline for tax payments. The Treasury Department estimated that the film was seen by 60 million people. A Gallup poll indicated that The New Spirit affected 37% of the taxpayers on their willingness to pay. As Walt had predicted, many theaters that received the Treasury film at no expense canceled their order for Donald Duck cartoons. Only the Radio City Music Hall sent a check for the Disney cartoon it had ordered, but didn't show. When the bill for The New Spirit was presented to the Treasury, Morgenthau questioned it. The total was $80,000, and the secretary complained to Walt. "You said you could make a cartoon for $43,000. Walt explained that his own cost had been $47,000 because of the hurry to complete the project. The rest of the expense was caused by the huge order for Technicolor prints. Morgenthau said he would have to go to Congress for a deficiency appropriation. It was submitted at the same time the president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, had appointed an exotic dancer to a civil defense post. Congressmen denounced employment of a fan dancer and Donald Duck as examples of boondoggling in civil defense. Walter Winchell defended Disney in his newspaper column and radio broadcast, but Walt received mail accusing him of being a war profiteer. Donald Duck also starred in the most popular of the wartime Disney shorts, Der Fuhrer's Face. The storyline showed Donald having a nightmare in which he dreamed he was working in a German munitions factory. Oliver Wallace, the one-time movie theater organist who became a prolific composer for the Disney studio, was assigned to write a song for Donald and his companions to sing in saluting Adolf Hitler. Wallace said he was riding a bicycle along the studio street when the inspiration came to him, and he nearly fell off. The idea to punctuate the Howls with overripe raspberries. The contemptuous treatment of Hitler delighted audience throughout America, and the song became one of the most popular during the war. Der Fuhrer's Face was translated into all European languages and smuggled into the continent by the underground, infuriating the Nazi high command. Victory Through Air Power was a unique Disney venture. It was an advocacy film not sponsored by the government but produced by Walt Disney because he shared the beliefs of Alexander de Seversky. Until his trip to South America, Walt's acquaintance with air travel had been an occasional cross-country flight. Then he flew over Amazon jungles and through Andean passes, saw Brazil, Argentina, and Chile more thoroughly and faster than he could have any other way. Along the way, he talked to pilots and ground crews, prowled through hangars and control towers, asking endless questions about how things worked. By the time he returned to Los Angeles, he had traveled 20,000 miles, and he was a confirmed proponent of the airplane. Walt was overwhelmed by the logic of the 1942 book, Victory Through Air Power, written by Major Alexander P. de Seversky, once a commander of Russian air squadrons in the First World War, later an inventor of bomb sights and navigation controls, a speed flyer, an advocate of air power to win World War II. A naturalized citizen, he convinced many of his fellow Americans with the arguments in his book. Historian Charles Beard called Victory Through Air Power a more important book for Americans than all the other war books put together. The New York Herald Tribune commented that the Seversky book, if read and heeded, might become a turning point in the war. On May 4, 1942, Walt telegraphed his New York representative. "Am anxious contact Major Alexander de Seversky by telephone and mail. Will you endeavor get this information to me earliest possible moment, but definitely eliminate my name from all inquiries made?" Walt reached Seversky and said he wanted to make a film of Victory Through Air Power. Within a few weeks, the project had started with a crew that had recently completed Bambi after 5 years of production. Because of the urgency of its theme and the changing world events, the new film had to be finished within months. By July, preliminary storyboards had been prepared, and Seversky came to the studio to assist. He and Walt proved good collaborators, sparking ideas off each other. Do you think there's anything into taking the people back 40 years and showing the progress we have made? It would be a little reminiscent thing. Show how progress in this speeding up during the First War, and then slowing down a bit in peacetime, and then shot up again during the war. Seversky. Sure, and for the war, the progress will still be faster. You could point out that when the Germans bombed Coventry, they used 500 airplanes and unloaded 250 tons of bombs. And today, at Rostov, 50 planes carried 250 tons of bombs. In 2 years, a ratio of 10 to 1. Walt. We leave here to go back 40 years ago to the historic Wright brothers taking off and show this telegram and then that little item in the newspaper about their being home for Christmas. Then suppose we move along to the start of the last war and how everything advances in wartime. Show how when the last war started, they didn't even have enough guns in their planes. They go on about a few years when they have those dogfights and fancy maneuvers. Seversky. Yes, and they had the Sikorsky bombers within 3 years. Walt. And at the beginning of the war, range was practically nothing. But right after the war, they had this Navy plane non-stop flight to the Azores. Seversky. And then you could show how commercial aviation had developed wonderfully since then. Of course, we paid no attention to the military end, and the military planes did not develop as fast as the commercial. But since the beginning of the war, we have advanced terrifically. Walt. What did you use in the war? A gun? Seversky. Well, back in 1915, all I had was a pistol. Then later we used automatic rifles, and then we started using machine guns. Walt. At first, they used to wave to each other when they passed each other on their way back to their destination. Then one Frenchman put some bricks in the plane. He didn't want to wave at the Germans. And the next time he passed, he threw a brick at a German, and from there it progressed to dogfighting. Seversky. Korsakov was flying with a big heavy ball with a hook on it, and when he met another plane, he threw the ball out, and the hook would catch on the enemy plane. This ball would have another ball attached to it, and the other ball would tear up the plane. He downed a couple of planes that way. Seversky was designated as technical advisor on victory through air power, but he became more than that. A draftsman and engineer, he created sketches which were used as guides by the Disney artist. He remained at the studio throughout the 8-month production period, changing elements of the script as events of the war substantiated his prediction. One sequence theorized on the use of air power to eliminate hydropower dams on the enemy. Before the film could be completed, the Royal Air Force bombed the Rhineland dams in almost the exact method proposed by Seversky. When Walt was in Washington, he was invited to a meeting of high naval officers. They queried him about victory through air power, and one of the admirals complained, "Do you know what that's going to do to our battleship program?" Walt replied, "Gee, you don't really believe in battleships, do you?" They did indeed, and they offered arguments. "I believe in air power," Walt insisted. "I just want to tell the story of air power." The Navy men persisted, and Walt later omitted portions of the film illustrating Seversky's bias against heavy ships. Victory Through Air Power was released in July of 1943, only 14 months after Walt had first talked to Seversky. The Disney selling force steadfastly avoided the term propaganda, but that's what the film was. As such, it succeeded, exerting a vast influence on the thinking of both the public and policymakers. In the biography of advertising man Albert Lasker, Taken at the Flood, John Gunther wrote that Lasker had long tried to arrange a meeting between Seversky and President Roosevelt, or to screen Victory Through Air Power at the White House, but Lasker had failed because of the watchfulness of Fleet Admiral William D. Leahy, who thought that Seversky was a crackpot, Gunther added. Meantime, the film received wide attention in theaters in England. Lasker, through a British friend, got a print to Winston Churchill, and the Prime Minister was much impressed by it. Came the Quebec Conference between Roosevelt and Churchill in the summer of 1943. Critical military decisions preparatory to the invasion of Europe the next year had to be made, but the conference was deadlocked. FDR and General Marshall wanted to set a definite date for their operation, but Churchill, their RAF, and General Arnold felt that this should not be done until certain conditions were met, such as the undisputed command of the air over English Channel. In an effort to break through the impasse, Churchill asked Roosevelt if he had ever seen Victory Through Air Power. FDR said no, and a print was flown by fighter plane from New York to Quebec. The President and the Prime Minister saw it together that night privately, and Roosevelt was much excited by the way Disney's aircraft masterfully wiped ships off the seas. It was run again the next day, and then FDR invited the Joint Chiefs to have a look. This played an important role in the decision, which was then taken to give the D-Day invasion sufficient air power. The film lost $436,000 for Walt Disney Productions, and Walt admitted later, "It was a stupid thing to do as a business venture. It was just something that I believed in, and for no other reason than that, I did it." Victory through air power contributed to the downward trend of the Disney finances during the war. Bambi, released in August 1942, had earned a disappointing $1.2 million in the United States, with foreign receipts at $2.19 million. Saludos Amigos, issued in February of 1943, drew 500,000 in the United States and 700,000 abroad, much of it from South America. Since the film cost under 300,000, it provided a profit. As in the Depression, the Disney studio fell to share in the prosperity of the motion picture business. The other companies were grinding out war movies and musicals for an entertainment-hungry nation, and theaters were earning huge profits. But not with Disney Pictures. There was no Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs to rescue the Disney brothers from debt. The studio issued a dozen short cartoons annually during the war. Returns on them were limited by the economics of the movie business. The training and propaganda films contracted by the government barely paid for maintaining the staff and studio. The indebtedness to the Bank of America climbed to more than $4 million, and some of the bank's board members expressed concern over the revolving line of credit extended to Disney. One day, Joe Rosenberg, the bank's Los Angeles liaison with the studio, telephoned Roy to request that he and Walt answer questions about their loan at the board of directors meeting in San Francisco. In later years, Roy enjoyed recounting the story of how he and Walt traveled north in a state of gloom. They had never before been summoned to a command appearance before the board. With the war continuing to occupy the studio's major efforts, they could offer little hope for an immediate upturn in the company's finances. Their gloom deepened when they were escorted into the Bank of America's dark-paneled boardroom and saw the 12 solemn-faced directors seated around the table. Nothing could proceed until the arrival of A.P. Gianni, the founder and board chairman of Bank of America. After 15 minutes, he entered, leonine-faced and commanding in presence. He declined to take a chair, listened to the discussions as he walked around the table. As he passed the Disneys, he nudged them in the backs and muttered, "Don't look so downhearted. It isn't going to be that bad." Walt and Roy found reason for hope. AP had long been their champion. When traveling in Europe, he sometimes sent them postcards with a message. "I saw one of your pictures, and it was pretty good." The matter of the Disney loan came before the board, and Walt and Roy explained how war conditions had interrupted the studio's profitability. Gianni began interrogating the directors. "You've been lending the Disneys a lot of money. How many of their pictures have you seen? Which ones?" He demanded answers from each board member, and he discovered that several of them had seen none of the Disney movies. "Well, I've seen them," Gianni remarked. "I've been watching the Disney pictures quite closely, because I knew we were lending them money far above the financial risk. But I realized that there's nothing about those pictures that will be changed by the war. They're good this year, they're good next year, and they're good the year after. Now there's a war on, and the Disney's markets are in trouble. Their money's frozen, or else they can't get in countries. You have to relax and give them time to market their product. This war isn't going to last forever." He strode out of the room. Walt and Roy returned to Los Angeles with the assurance that they would be able to stay in business. Well, that concludes today's reading of Bob Thomas's Walt Disney, an American Original. And remember, thank you for your time. Your time is very important to me, because today's special moments make tomorrow's memories. Have a wonderful day.